My fiancé's father looked at me across the dinner table and said, "The military isn't a place for people who don't understand discipline." He had no idea I commanded the very base he used to brag about. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't correct him. I simply picked up my fork and continued eating. What happened next changed the entire atmosphere in that dining room. But before I tell you how that night unfolded, I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end of my story, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always find it fascinating to see just how far these stories travel. That evening started like any other family dinner. Or at least it was supposed to. My fiancé, Daniel, had been asking me for weeks to meet his parents properly. We had been together for almost 2 years, and although I had briefly met them once during a holiday gathering, this was the first time they had invited me to their home for a real dinner. The kind of dinner where parents decide whether the woman their son plans to marry is good enough. Their house sat on the edge of a quiet neighborhood outside Jacksonville, Florida. A large colonial-style home with white pillars, neatly trimmed hedges, and a driveway long enough to fit half a dozen cars. The kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about traditional American families. As Daniel pulled into the driveway, he glanced over at me. "You ready for this?" he asked with a half-nervous smile. I returned the smile. I've handled tougher situations. That was technically true. But Daniel didn't know the full extent of it. He knew I worked in the military. He knew I had spent most of my adult life in service. But the exact nature of my position wasn't something I talked about casually at family dinners. And I had a feeling tonight would be interesting. Inside the house, everything smelled like roasted chicken, garlic, and fresh bread. Warm lighting filled the dining room, reflecting softly off polished wooden furniture that had probably been in the family for decades. Daniel's mother, Linda, greeted us first. She was warm, polite, and clearly doing her best to make the evening comfortable. "Oh, you must be starving," she said, ushering us inside. "Dinner's almost ready." But standing behind her in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room was Daniel's father, Thomas Reynolds. Tall, broad-shouldered, gray hair cut short in a military style that suggested he had never quite left the life behind. Even out of uniform, you could recognize the posture instantly. Retired military. He studied me the way experienced officers sometimes study new recruits. Not unfriendly, but definitely evaluating. "So," he said, extending his hand, "you're the one my son's been talking about." His handshake was firm. Testing. I matched it easily. "Yes, sir." His eyebrow lifted slightly. I could tell he noticed the grip. Some habits never go away. We moved into the dining room shortly afterward. The table was already set. White plates, silver cutlery, cloth napkins folded carefully beside each glass. The kind of formal dinner setting people use when they want to make a good impression. Or when they're quietly judging you. Conversation started politely enough. Linda asked about my family, where I grew up, how Daniel and I met. Daniel answered most of those questions for me, clearly hoping to keep things smooth. But Thomas watched me the entire time. Listening. Observing. Waiting. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "So," he said, finally addressing me directly, "Daniel tells me you work in the military." "I do." "What kind of work?" The question was casual on the surface, but the tone behind it wasn't. I took a sip of water before answering. "Operational command." He gave a small chuckle. "Command, huh?" The word hung in the air for a moment. "Administrative command?" he asked. No, another pause. Daniel shifted slightly beside me. He knew that tone. Thomas picked up his fork again, cutting into his chicken as he continued speaking. "You know," he said, "the military has changed a lot over the years." Linda shot him a quick look. But he continued anyway. "Back when I served, command meant something different. You had to earn it. Long hours. Field operations. Real leadership." I kept my expression neutral. "I agree." He nodded as if pleased with that answer. Then he leaned forward slightly. "But these days," he added, "they hand out titles a little easier." Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad," Thomas waved a hand dismissively. "I'm just saying," he continued, glancing back at me, "the military isn't really a place for people who treat it like a career stepping stone. Silence spread slowly across the table. Linda looked uncomfortable. Daniel looked like he wanted to disappear. And Thomas kept talking. He began telling stories from his time in service. Deployments. Training exercises. Long nights in command tents. The sort of stories retired officers love to share when they feel they're speaking to someone who hasn't truly experienced the same world. Normally, I enjoy listening to stories like that, but there was something slightly ironic about this one, because the base he kept mentioning, the one he spoke about with such pride, was currently under my command. He just didn't know it. And the more he talked, the clearer it became that he believed I was simply another civilian girlfriend with a desk job somewhere in the military bureaucracy. At one point he leaned back again and looked directly at me. "So tell me something," he said. "What rank are you?" Daniel stiffened beside me. He knew that question could change the entire tone of the evening. I set my fork down calmly. Then I met Thomas Reynolds' eyes across the table. And for the first time that night, I allowed myself a very small smile, because he was about to learn something that would make the rest of that dinner very quiet. For a few seconds no one spoke. Thomas Reynolds' question still hung in the air like smoke that hadn't decided where to drift. "What rank are you?" It sounded simple enough. Just curiosity from a retired officer talking to someone who claimed to work in the military. But the way he asked it told a different story. He wasn't really asking. He was testing. Across the table, Daniel shifted slightly in his chair. I could feel the tension in the room without even looking at him. After 2 years together, he had learned how these conversations could go when strong personalities met. Especially when his father believed he had the upper hand. Linda quietly poured more iced tea into everyone's glasses, the soft clink of the pitcher against the glass the only sound in the room. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I picked up my napkin and gently wiped my hands, buying myself a few seconds. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because moments like this require patience. Leadership, real leadership, is often about timing. Thomas leaned back in his chair again, clearly interpreting my silence as hesitation. His lips curved slightly in what looked like a knowing smile. "Don't worry," he said casually. "Everyone starts somewhere." Daniel looked down at his plate. Linda shot him another warning glance. But Thomas continued, clearly enjoying the role of teacher. "When I first joined," he said, cutting into another piece of chicken, "I spent my first 3 years in the field before I even thought about command positions." He glanced at me again. "Most people today want to skip that part." I nodded slowly. "I understand." He seemed satisfied with that response. The conversation moved briefly to other topics. Daniel's work at the engineering firm, Linda's volunteer work at the local hospital, the new housing development being built just outside the neighborhood. But the earlier question hadn't disappeared. Thomas returned to it only a few minutes later. "So what branch are you in?" he asked. "United States Marine Corps." That got his attention immediately. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Marines?" "Yes, sir." Now the smile on his face changed. It wasn't mocking, but it definitely carried a hint of disbelief. "That's not an easy branch," he said. "I know." He nodded again, studying me more carefully now. "You ever deployed?" "Yes." "Where?" "Several places." I kept my answers short. Simple. The kind of answers you give when you're not interested in turning dinner into a resume presentation. But Thomas interpreted the brevity differently. He leaned forward slightly. "You know," he said, lowering his voice the way older officers sometimes do when they think they're sharing wisdom, "real leadership in the Marines is something you earn in the field. It's not about titles or desk positions." Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad, maybe we should." But Thomas held up a hand. "I'm just having a conversation," he said. Then he looked back at me. "You mentioned operational command earlier," he continued. "That usually means logistics or planning support." I didn't correct him. I simply took another bite of my dinner. Across the table, Linda gave me a sympathetic look. I could tell she realized where this was heading. Thomas, however, was becoming more comfortable by the minute. Retired officers sometimes fall into that pattern when they believe they're speaking with someone who hasn't truly experienced the same level of responsibility they once carried. It's not always arrogance. Sometimes it's habit. But tonight it was definitely leaning toward arrogance. He began talking again about the base he had served at during the later years of his career. Camp Barrett. He spoke about it the way people talk about a place that shaped their identity. The long training fields. The command buildings. The pressure of preparing Marines for real-world deployments. As he described the base, I noticed a small detail. He kept referring to the current command structure there. Specifically, he complained about the new leadership. They've been making a lot of changes lately, he said, shaking his head slightly. Different priorities. Different standards. I finally looked up from my plate. What kind of changes? He shrugged. From what I've heard, they've been restructuring units and adjusting training protocols. He took a sip of iced tea. Command decisions. He chuckled softly. I'd love to sit down with whoever's running that place now and explain how things should actually be done. Daniel froze beside me. Linda stared at the table. Because by that point, they were starting to realize something. Something Thomas Reynolds still hadn't figured out yet. I set my fork down slowly. Camp Barrett. The base he had spent the last 10 minutes discussing. The base he believed was being mismanaged by inexperienced leadership. The base he said he could run better than whoever was currently in charge. There was only one small detail missing from his entire speech. The fact that the person currently commanding Camp Barrett was sitting directly across the dinner table from him. And he was about to learn that. Very soon. For a moment I simply watched him. Thomas Reynolds was still talking about Camp Barrett as if it were a distant place. Some facility run by people he had never met. His tone had shifted from storytelling into something else now. Evaluation. Judgment. The kind retired officers sometimes carry with them long after they hang up the uniform. I hear they've been changing the training rotations, he continued, shaking his head slightly. Too many classroom hours. Not enough field time. Daniel slowly set his fork down. Dad. But Thomas didn't stop. When we ran that base, he added, emphasizing the word we, things were different. I could feel Linda's eyes move toward me. Not with curiosity. With concern. She understood something was happening. Something Thomas hadn't noticed yet. I leaned back slightly in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. Really? I said. Calmly. He nodded immediately. Oh, absolutely. He looked almost energized now, as if he had finally found an audience he believed needed instruction. Training a Marine isn't about making things comfortable, he said. It's about pressure, stress, real leadership. He pointed his fork toward the table for emphasis. That base produced some of the toughest Marines in the country. I gave a small nod. I've heard that. You've heard that, he repeated with a faint smile. Then he leaned back again, crossing his arms. Let me guess, he said. You're probably working somewhere in operations support, right? I didn't answer. He continued anyway. Logistics maybe, he said. Planning, coordination, scheduling exercises. Important work, sure, but not the kind of thing that prepares you for actual command. Across the table, Daniel rubbed a hand across his face. Linda quietly cleared her throat. But Thomas kept going. I've seen it happen a lot in the last 15 years, he continued. The military starts promoting people who look good on paper instead of the ones who've actually been in the dirt. He shook his head slowly. Standards slip that way. For the first time that evening, I felt the corner of my mouth twitch slightly. Not out of anger. Out of irony. Because everything he was saying about leadership, everything he believed about the importance of command, was exactly why I had been given the position I held. But he wasn't ready to hear that yet. Instead, he picked up his glass of iced tea and took a slow sip. You know, he said after a moment, I'd really like to meet whoever's in charge over there now. He gestured casually with his glass. At Camp Barrett. He set the glass back down. From what I've heard, they've been reorganizing entire units, changing the field training schedules, rotating command teams. He gave a short laugh. That kind of restructuring usually means someone new came in trying to prove something. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Dad, maybe. But Thomas raised a finger. I'm serious, he said. Then he looked directly at me again. If I ever ran into the officer commanding that base, I'd probably give them a few pointers. Linda froze. Daniel stopped moving entirely. and I remained exactly where I was. Still. Quiet. Watching. Thomas continued speaking, unaware that the room had gone completely silent. Running a base like Barrett takes experience, he said. You don't just walk in and start rewriting the system. His voice carried the calm confidence of someone who believed he understood the situation perfectly. That kind of command requires years of leadership in the field. He leaned forward slightly. You agree with that, don't you? I met his eyes. Yes, I said. I do. He nodded once, satisfied. But then he asked the question that finally brought the conversation to the edge. So tell me something, he said. What exactly do you do at Camp Barrett? The room felt smaller suddenly. Daniel looked like he might stop breathing. Linda stared at her plate. And Thomas Reynolds waited. He expected a simple answer. Maybe something polite. Maybe something vague. What he did not expect was the truth. I placed my napkin neatly beside my plate. Then I looked directly at him. And for the first time that evening, I decided it was time to stop letting him guess. Because the next sentence I spoke was about to end the lecture he had been giving all night. And changed the entire tone of that dinner. The room stayed quiet after his question. What exactly do you do at Camp Barrett? Thomas Reynolds looked at me with calm confidence, the way someone does when they believe they already know the answer. He expected something small. Something ordinary. Maybe logistics. Maybe planning. Maybe a junior officer position. Anything that would confirm the assumption he had been building all evening. Across the table, Daniel looked like he was holding his breath. Linda hadn't moved in several seconds. Her eyes were fixed on the tablecloth as if she already knew what was about to happen and wished she could stop it. But the moment had already arrived. I sat there for another second, letting the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to feel it. Then I answered. I command it. Thomas blinked. Not dramatically. Just once. The kind of blink people make when they think they've misheard something. Command what? He asked. Camp Barrett. For a moment nothing happened. Then his forehead creased slightly. He gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they think someone is joking. You mean you work under the command there? No, I shook my head once. I'm the commanding officer. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened all night. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. Linda looked up. And Thomas Reynolds stared at me. Really stared now. As if trying to process the words he had just heard. That base, he said slowly, is commanded by a brigadier general. Yes. Another pause. Then I said it plainly. That's my rank. The fork in his hand stopped moving. Not dropped. Just stopped. For the first time since we had sat down for dinner, Thomas Reynolds had nothing to say. His eyes searched my face as if looking for some sign that I was exaggerating. Or joking. Or bluffing. But I didn't move. I didn't smile. I didn't explain. I simply held his gaze. Daniel broke the silence first. Dad, he said quietly. I told you she worked in the military. Thomas didn't respond. He was still looking at me. Then slowly, carefully, he asked one more question. You're telling me you're the one currently commanding Camp Barrett? Yes. I kept my voice calm. Matter of fact. The same way I would deliver information in a briefing room. Another long pause followed. Linda set her glass down softly. You didn't tell us that, she said gently. I turned toward her. You didn't ask. That wasn't meant as criticism. Just the truth. My job wasn't something I usually introduced at dinner tables. Especially not when meeting someone's parents for the first time. Thomas finally leaned back in his chair. But the confident posture he had carried earlier that night had shifted. Not completely gone. Just unsettled. You're serious, he said. Yes. He rubbed a hand slowly across his jaw. Then he looked down at the table. The same table where, just minutes earlier, he had been explaining to me how leadership in the Marines was supposed to work. The same table where he had said he'd like to give the commanding officer of Camp Barrett a few pointers. Daniel tried not to smile. Linda definitely noticed. And Thomas Reynolds sat there for another long moment before speaking again. Well, he said finally, that explains a few things. I didn't respond. Because moments like this don't need commentary. They need space. And the space in that dining room had changed completely. The man who had spent most of the evening lecturing me about military leadership had just discovered that the officer he wanted to advise was sitting across the table the entire time. But the night wasn't over yet. As what happened next was something Thomas Reynolds definitely hadn't expected. No one spoke for several seconds after that. The words Brigadier General seemed to settle over the dinner table like a weight that no one knew how to move. Thomas Reynolds sat back in his chair, but the confidence he had carried earlier in the evening was gone now. Not completely. Men like him rarely lose confidence overnight, but something inside it had clearly shifted. He studied me again. Not the way he had when I first walked into the house. Before, he had been measuring me. Now he was reevaluating everything he thought he knew. Daniel quietly exhaled beside me. I hadn't realized he had been holding his breath until that moment. Linda looked between the two of us, then at her husband. "Well," she said gently, trying to smooth the tension in the room, "that's certainly impressive." I gave her a small nod. "Thank you." Thomas remained quiet. His eyes moved slowly across the table, stopping for a moment on Daniel. "You knew about this?" he asked. Daniel shrugged slightly. "I told you she was in the Marines." "That's not exactly the same thing," Thomas muttered. Daniel smiled faintly. "No, it isn't." Another long pause settled over the table. Thomas picked up his fork again, though he didn't actually take a bite. Instead, he turned the utensil slowly between his fingers as if trying to organize his thoughts. Finally, he looked back at me. "So you're telling me," he said carefully, "that you're the one responsible for the recent changes at Barrett?" "Yes." I kept my tone even. "The restructuring of the training rotations," he continued. "Yes." "The command team adjustments." "Yes." He nodded once. Slowly. Then he leaned back again. "That explains the field rotation schedule." I didn't answer. Not because I didn't have one, but because there was no need. He already understood what the answer would be. Linda reached across the table and began clearing a few plates, though dinner was clearly not finished yet. It was the kind of small action people take when they're trying to release tension from a room. Daniel helped her, gathering glasses and moving them slightly to the side. But Thomas still hadn't moved. He looked thoughtful now. Not defensive. Not embarrassed. Just recalculating. "You know," he said after a moment, "when I heard about those changes, I assumed whoever made them didn't understand the history of that base." I nodded. "That's fair." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You don't disagree?" "I think history is important," I said calmly. "But leadership also requires adapting when circumstances change." He studied my face again. Not challenging this time. Just listening. "The operational tempo for the Marine station there has changed over the last decade," I continued. "Training structures have to reflect that." Thomas tapped the fork lightly against his plate. "That's exactly what the official report said." Daniel couldn't help smiling. "Because she wrote the report," he said. Thomas looked back at me. "Did you?" "Yes." Another quiet moment passed. But this silence felt different from the earlier ones. Before, it had been uncomfortable. Now it felt more like respect slowly finding its place in the conversation. Thomas finally set the fork down. "I'll admit something," he said. Linda paused in the kitchen doorway, clearly curious about what he was about to say. Thomas looked directly at me. "When you first walked in tonight, I assumed Daniel had brought home someone who worked in an administrative office somewhere." I didn't react. He continued. "I've spent 30 years around Marines," he said. "You start thinking you can read people quickly." I nodded slightly. "That's a common habit." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Apparently I misread this one." Daniel laughed quietly. "You misread it by about 4 ranks." Thomas shook his head once, almost amused now. Then he looked back at me again. "You let me talk for quite a while tonight," he said. "Yes." "Why?" The answer was simple. "Because you cared about what you were saying." That caught him slightly off guard. "I also wanted to hear your perspective," I added. "You spent years serving at that base." He considered that. Then he leaned forward slightly. "Well," he said, "since we're being honest," he paused. And the next thing he said surprised everyone at the table. Maybe I should hear more about why you changed those training rotations. Daniel raised his eyebrows. Linda smiled. And for the first time that night, Thomas Reynolds wasn't lecturing me anymore. He was asking. For the first time that night, the tension in the room shifted. Not disappeared. Just changed direction. Thomas Reynolds was no longer leaning back like a man delivering a lecture. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, elbows resting near the edge of the table, looking at me with something closer to curiosity. Maybe I should hear more about why you changed those training rotations, he had said. The room stayed quiet for a moment after that. Daniel looked from his father to me, clearly surprised. Linda paused halfway through stacking a plate in the kitchen doorway, waiting to see how I would answer. I took a small sip of water before speaking. The short version? I said. Thomas nodded. The short version. The operational demands on our Marines have changed. He listened without interrupting. Deployment cycles are faster now, I continued. The missions they're preparing for require different kinds of readiness than they did 15 or 20 years ago. Thomas tapped one finger lightly on the table. Go on. The old training rotation at Barrett focused heavily on endurance field exercises, I said, which are still important. But modern operations require a stronger integration between field command and rapid response coordination. Daniel leaned slightly toward me. You mean the joint training drills? Yes. Thomas noticed that detail immediately. You're coordinating with other units now. Yes. Army and Navy support teams. He nodded slowly. That's a big shift. It had to be. The conversation had changed tone completely now. Earlier, Thomas had been speaking like a retired officer explaining things to someone younger. Now he was listening the way experienced Marines listen when they recognize someone speaking from actual command experience. Still cautious, but attentive. He picked up his glass again, taking a slow drink. You're rotating leadership assignments through field command now too, he said. Yes. That wasn't the structure when I served there. I know. His eyebrows lifted. You reviewed the old command reports? All of them. That answer seemed to surprise him. You read reports from before your time? Yes. Why? Because leadership decisions don't exist in isolation. He leaned back slightly. That was the first moment I saw something close to approval in his expression. You're studying the history before changing the system. Yes. Daniel smiled quietly beside me. Linda returned to the table and sat down again, clearly relieved that the conversation had moved away from confrontation. Thomas rested his forearms on the table. What made you decide the old structure needed to change? He asked. That question mattered. Not because it challenged my authority, but because it showed he was thinking seriously now. So I answered. The way I would answer a briefing question from a senior officer. 3 things, I said. He nodded. Let's hear them. First, I said, deployment tempo. Marines stationed at Barrett now rotate into overseas assignments more frequently than they did 15 years ago. That's true, he admitted. Second, I continued, modern combat environments rely more heavily on coordination between units. Training has to reflect that. Thomas nodded again. And the third. I paused briefly before answering. Leadership preparation. His eyes narrowed slightly with interest. What about it? Many young officers arriving at Barrett have strong academic training, I said, but they need more exposure to real-time command pressure before deployment. Thomas leaned back. That's why you're rotating command responsibility earlier. Yes. The room stayed quiet again. But this silence felt different from the earlier ones. This one wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Thomas ran a hand slowly across his chin. You know, he said, that actually solves a problem we struggled with years ago. I raised an eyebrow slightly. Which one? Transitioning lieutenants into real command situations fast enough. Daniel looked between us like he was watching 2 officers analyze a strategy map. You used to complain about that all the time, he said to his father. Thomas gave a short nod. Because it was a real issue. Then he looked back at me again. Rotating them through field command earlier might actually fix that. That's the idea. He sat quietly for a few seconds. Then he chuckled softly. Well. Daniel looked curious. What? Thomas shook his head slightly. I spent half the evening explaining Marine leadership to someone who clearly understands it better than I expected. Daniel laughed. Linda smiled. And I simply said the only thing that made sense. Experience teaches all of us eventually. Thomas looked at me for another moment. Then he gave a slow nod. And the respect in that gesture was something very different from the attitude he had when the dinner first began. For a while after that, dinner continued in a way none of us had expected when the evening began. The earlier tension had faded, replaced by something quieter. Not exactly comfort. More like two people from different generations slowly realizing they had walked the same path, just at different times. Thomas leaned back again, though this time his posture didn't carry the same authority it had earlier. Instead he looked thoughtful, almost reflective. You know, he said after a moment, Barrett wasn't always the base people think it is now. I listened. Daniel had told me before that his father rarely talked about his service in detail, unless someone specifically asked. Tonight, however, he seemed willing. When I first arrived there, Thomas continued, it was chaos. Linda smiled faintly. You've told that story before. Not like this, he said. Then he looked back at me. We were transitioning between command structures. Half the training schedules didn't make sense anymore. And nobody wanted to admit it. I nodded. That kind of transition is difficult. Difficult, he said with a short laugh. It nearly broke the place. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What happened? Thomas rubbed the back of his neck as if the memory still carried weight. Leadership changes, he said. Old commanders leaving. New officers stepping in. Everyone trying to prove something. His eyes shifted toward me again. That part probably sounds familiar. I didn't deny it. It does. Because command transitions are rarely smooth. Especially at bases that carry long traditions. Thomas continued. The hardest part wasn't the logistics, he said. It was the culture. That caught my attention. What do you mean? He tapped a finger lightly against the table. Marines get used to doing things a certain way. When someone changes the system, even if the change makes sense, people resist. Daniel nodded. That happens in engineering too. Thomas shook his head. It's worse in the Marines. Then he looked directly at me. You must have run into that already. I smiled slightly. More than once. Linda laughed softly from the other side of the table. I can imagine. Thomas leaned forward again, resting his forearms on the table. What was the hardest part for you? He asked. The question surprised me a little. Not because it was difficult, but because he was asking it sincerely now. Not testing. Not lecturing. Just asking. I thought about the answer for a moment. Convincing people the changes weren't about replacing the past, I said. Thomas nodded immediately. Yes. They were about preparing for the future. He nodded again, slower this time. That's exactly the problem. Daniel glanced between us. What problem? Thomas looked at his son. People assume change means someone is disrespecting the old system. Daniel shrugged. Sometimes it does. Sometimes, Thomas agreed. Then he looked back at me. But not always. I could tell something had shifted in his thinking. Earlier that evening, he had been certain the leadership at Barrett didn't understand the base. Now he was realizing that the person responsible for those decisions might actually understand it better than he assumed. You know what the hardest decision I ever made there was? He asked. I shook my head. What? Shutting down one of the old training fields. Linda looked surprised. You never told me that. Thomas shrugged slightly. It wasn't popular. Why did you do it? Daniel asked. Thomas looked down at the table for a moment before answering. Because the field was designed for equipment we no longer used. Daniel frowned. So it wasn't useful anymore. It was useful for tradition, Thomas said. Then he looked back at me. But not for preparing Marines for the next war. I nodded slowly. That sentence carried the kind of understanding only people with command experience usually develop. Sometimes leadership means preserving tradition. Sometimes it means letting parts of it go. Thomas studied me again for a moment. You've had to make decisions like that already, haven't you? Yes. People pushed back? Of course. Daniel laughed quietly. I bet. Thomas gave a small smile. Then he said something that changed the tone of the night again. You know what I realized a few minutes ago? What? Daniel asked. Thomas looked directly at me. When you first walked into this house tonight, he paused. I thought I was about to spend dinner explaining the Marines to someone who didn't understand them. He shook his head slightly. But now I'm starting to think. He let the sentence trail off. I waited. Then he finished it. I might be learning something instead. And hearing that from a man like Thomas Reynolds was something I hadn't expected when Daniel first pulled into that driveway. For a little while after that, the atmosphere around the table settled into something calmer. Linda brought out coffee and a simple dessert, apple pie she had baked earlier that afternoon. The kind of dessert that makes a house feel warm even when the conversation has been complicated. Daniel helped her bring the plates to the table. Thomas remained seated, his hands folded loosely in front of him now. The earlier edge in his voice had faded. In its place was something quieter, thoughtful. He looked at the pie for a moment, then glanced back at me. You know, he said slowly, I don't meet many officers still in active command. That makes sense, I replied. Most people don't. He nodded. Especially not over dinner. Daniel chuckled. Especially not when they're dating your son. That earned him a small look from Linda. Daniel, she said softly. But Thomas waved a hand. No, he's right. Then he looked back at me. You and Daniel have been together 2 years, he said. Yes. And you never mentioned your rank to us before tonight. I shook my head. It didn't seem important. Thomas raised one eyebrow. A brigadier general's rank is usually considered important. In the Marines, yes. And outside the Marines? I gave a small shrug. Outside the Marines, I'm just someone having dinner with my fiancé's parents. That answer seemed to land with him. He nodded once. That's a good way to look at it. Linda set the coffee cups down and finally sat back in her chair. I wish we'd known earlier, she said kindly. We would have prepared a little more carefully. I smiled. Please don't. Thomas looked curious. Why not? Because tonight was honest. Daniel looked at me, understanding what I meant. Thomas studied my face for a moment. You mean the part where I spent half the evening explaining Marine leadership to a Marine general? Daniel burst out laughing. Linda tried not to smile. Thomas exhaled slowly, shaking his head. Well, he admitted, when you put it that way. He leaned back again. I suppose that wasn't my finest moment. I didn't rush to respond. Sometimes people need space to reach their own conclusions. After a moment he continued. You know something interesting, he said. What? When I retired from the Corps, I thought I understood how the next generation of officers would operate. He paused. But tonight reminded me something. What's that? Daniel asked. Thomas glanced at his son, then back at me. That the Marines don't stop evolving. Linda nodded. That's probably a good thing. Thomas looked thoughtful. When I was younger, I had commanders who thought our generation was ruining the Corps. Daniel laughed. That sounds familiar. It does, doesn't it? Thomas rested his hands on the table again. But eventually I realized something. He turned his attention back to me. The officers coming up behind us weren't weaker. He paused. They were just dealing with a different battlefield. I nodded. That's exactly the challenge. Daniel looked curious. What do you mean? The nature of conflict changes, I said. Technology changes. Coordination changes. The way Marines prepare has to change with it. Thomas listened carefully. And if it doesn't? Then leadership fails. He nodded slowly. That's a blunt answer. Leadership usually requires blunt answers. Linda smiled slightly. That sounds like the Marines. Daniel leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying how the conversation had transformed. You two sound like you're sitting in a strategy meeting. Thomas chuckled. Maybe we are. Then he said something that caught me off guard. You know, he said, I used to run officer training sessions at Barrett when I was still in command. I read those records. He blinked. You did? Yes. What did you think? I considered the question carefully. They were effective. He waited. But I smiled slightly. They assumed most officers would stay in one operational structure for years. Thomas nodded. That was the reality back then. Now deployments shift faster. And leadership has to adapt faster. Yes. He sat quietly for a moment after that. Then he gave a small nod. Well, he said finally, it looks like Barrett ended up in capable hands. Daniel grinned. I've been telling you that for 2 years. Thomas glanced at him. You didn't tell me she was running the base. Daniel shrugged. You never asked. Linda laughed softly. And for the first time that evening the entire table relaxed. The conversation drifted to other topics after that. Daniel's upcoming project at work, Linda's garden, even a story about Daniel's childhood that made everyone laugh. But as the night continued, I noticed something interesting. Thomas Reynolds wasn't looking at me the way he had when dinner first started. The evaluation was gone. The assumptions were gone. What remained instead was something much rarer. Respect. And strangely enough, that respect would lead to something neither of us expected before the night was over. By the time dessert plates were empty, the atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The tension that had filled the table earlier was gone. In its place was something calmer, almost comfortable. Linda was clearing the last of the dishes while Daniel stood up to help her carry them into the kitchen. I started to stand too, but Linda waved me back into my chair. Oh, no, she said gently. You're a guest. Daniel laughed from the kitchen. She outranks half the people on the base, Mom. I think she can survive carrying a plate. Linda gave him a playful look. Tonight she's just family. That word hung in the air for a moment. Family. It was the first time anyone had used it since I walked into the house. Across the table, Thomas Reynolds sat quietly watching the exchange. Not evaluating anymore. Just observing. After a moment he leaned back in his chair again, crossing his arms loosely. You know, he said. This is the strangest dinner I've had in a long time. Daniel returned from the kitchen carrying 2 mugs of coffee. That's because you spent half of it lecturing a Marine general. Thomas gave him a sideways look. Don't remind me. Daniel set one of the mugs in front of me. Sorry about that earlier, he said quietly. You don't need to apologize. I know my dad, Daniel continued. Once he starts talking about the Corps, it's hard to stop him. I smiled slightly. That's not unusual. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Oh, I've seen that behavior in briefing rooms more than once. Daniel laughed. Linda returned to the table, drying her hands on a kitchen towel. Well, she said cheerfully, at least no one started arguing. Thomas gave a small grunt. That's because I realized halfway through dinner, I might have been talking to someone who outranked everyone I ever reported to. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That realization took you a while. Thomas shook his head slowly. Your generation moves fast. He turned his attention back to me. You said earlier you reviewed the old command reports from Barrett. Yes. Even the ones from the late 90s? Yes. That answer seemed to surprise him again. You read the ones written during my command period. I did. Daniel looked between us. You wrote reports back then? Thomas shrugged. Command summaries. Training evaluations. Operational reviews. Linda smiled faintly. He used to spend hours at his desk writing those. Thomas nodded. They were important. Then he looked back at me. What did you think of them? The question carried a little more weight than the others he had asked that evening. It wasn't a test. It was something else. Pride. I answered carefully. They were thorough. He waited. And they showed a clear understanding of how that base operated at the time. Daniel raised his eyebrows. That sounds like a compliment. It is, I said. Thomas studied my face for a moment. But the structure wouldn't work the same way today. No, he nodded slowly. I suspected that. There was no defensiveness in his voice this time. Just acceptance. Linda poured more coffee into everyone's mugs. I'm glad you two can actually talk about this, she said. Most dinner conversations don't involve military command structures. Daniel grinned. You should hear them when they start discussing strategy. Thomas shook his head slightly. I doubt she'd be interested in hearing my opinions after tonight. I met his eyes calmly. You'd be surprised. He looked curious. Oh, experience still matters. The room grew quiet again for a moment. Thomas tapped his fingers lightly on the table. You know, he said slowly, most retired officers struggle with something after they leave the service. What's that? Daniel asked. Letting go of command. Daniel nodded. I can imagine. Thomas glanced at me again. When you've spent years making decisions that affect hundreds of Marines. He paused. It's strange waking up one morning and realizing someone else is making those decisions now. I understood that feeling. Every commanding officer eventually faces it. Leadership doesn't disappear when the uniform comes off, I said. He looked up. No. It changes form. He considered that. Then he nodded slowly. That might be the best explanation I've heard. Daniel leaned forward, clearly enjoying the conversation. So basically, he said, you two just had a command transition discussion over apple pie. Linda laughed. That might be the most Marine Corps sentence I've ever heard. Thomas chuckled quietly. Then he looked back at me one more time. You know something, he said. What? When you first walked through that door tonight. He paused again. I thought I needed to evaluate the woman my son was bringing into this family. Daniel smirked. How'd that work out? Thomas looked at him. I'm still evaluating. Then he looked back at me. But now I'm evaluating something very different. I raised an eyebrow slightly. What's that? He gave a small thoughtful nod. Whether my son is capable of keeping up with you. Daniel nearly choked on his coffee. Linda laughed. And for the first time since the night began, the entire room felt completely at ease. But the evening still had one more moment waiting. A moment that would prove something important about respect, something both Thomas Reynolds and I understood very well. The laughter around the table slowly faded after Thomas's last comment. Whether my son is capable of keeping up with you. Daniel shook his head, still smiling. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Dad. Linda gathered the last empty coffee cups and carried them toward the kitchen again, though this time she didn't rush. The evening had settled into that quiet stage most family dinners reach after the food is gone and people finally relax. But something about Thomas Reynolds' posture told me the conversation wasn't completely finished yet. He sat there for a moment looking at the table. Not embarrassed. Not defensive. Just thinking. Daniel noticed it too. You okay? He asked. Thomas nodded slowly. Yeah. Then he leaned forward slightly and rested his hands on the table again. There's something I should probably say, he added. Daniel looked surprised. That sounds serious. Thomas ignored the comment and turned toward me. When you first walked in tonight, he said, I had already made up my mind about you. I didn't interrupt. I assumed you were someone Daniel cared about, he continued. But I also assumed you probably didn't understand the life he grew up around. He gestured lightly toward the walls of the house. This family has been around the Corps for a long time. Linda's voice floated from the kitchen. That's true. Thomas nodded. My father served. I served. Most of the people who came through this house when Daniel was a kid were Marines. Daniel smiled faintly. That explains the dinner conversations. Thomas continued. So when Daniel told me he was bringing someone serious home tonight, he paused. I figured I needed to see if you understood the world he was stepping into. Daniel raised an eyebrow. You were interviewing her? Thomas shrugged slightly. That's one way to put it. Linda returned to the table, setting a small bowl of fruit in the center. You've always done that, she said. Thomas nodded. I have. Then he looked directly at me again. But I misjudged something. I waited. You didn't just understand that world, he said. You're responsible for leading a large part of it. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That realization took him about 45 minutes. Thomas gave him a sideways look. I'm aware. The room went quiet again for a moment. Not awkward. Just reflective. Then Thomas did something that surprised all of us. He pushed his chair back slightly and stood up. Daniel blinked. Dad. Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the table for a second, then back at me. In the Marine Corps, he said slowly, there are certain habits that stay with you. I already knew where this was going, but Daniel didn't. What habits? He asked. Thomas straightened his posture slightly. When you meet someone who holds command authority, Daniel suddenly sat up straighter. Linda covered her mouth slightly, already realizing what was happening. Thomas turned fully toward me, and in the middle of his own dining room, the retired officer who had spent the first half of the night lecturing me about Marine leadership raised his hand in a sharp, precise motion. A Marine salute. Daniel's eyes widened. Dad. Thomas held the salute for just a moment. Not dramatic. Not exaggerated. Just respectful. Then he lowered his hand. I may be retired, he said calmly, but rank still matters. The room stayed completely silent. Daniel looked like he had never seen his father do that outside of a formal military ceremony. Linda smiled softly, and I returned the gesture the same way I would in uniform. A short professional nod. You don't have to do that here, I said. Thomas shook his head. No, his voice carried a calm certainty now. But I wanted to. He sat back down afterward, the moment passing as quietly as it had arrived. Daniel stared at him. Well, he said slowly, that's a first. Linda laughed gently. I've been married to him 30 years and I've never seen him salute anyone in this house. Thomas picked up his coffee again. Then tonight must be special. Daniel leaned toward me slightly. You realize my dad just showed you more respect than he shows most people he's worked with. I smiled faintly. Respect goes both ways. Thomas nodded once at that. Yes. And the way he said it made something very clear. The man who had started the evening treating me like someone who needed a lesson about Marine leadership was ending it acknowledging me as someone who carried that responsibility. But the night wasn't quite finished yet, because what Thomas Reynolds said next was something I never expected to hear from him. For a few seconds after the salute, no one spoke. Not because anyone felt uncomfortable, but because moments like that carry a certain weight. Anyone who has spent time around the Marine Corps understands it. A salute isn't just a gesture. It's recognition. Recognition of responsibility. Recognition of command. And recognition that someone has earned their place. Daniel was the first one to break the silence. Well, he said slowly leaning back in his chair. That's definitely the most unexpected thing that's happened at this table. Linda laughed softly. I agree. She looked at her husband with a mixture of amusement and curiosity. I didn't know you were planning to do that. Thomas picked up his coffee again. I wasn't. Daniel tilted his head. You just decided in the moment? Thomas nodded. Something like that. He looked back at me again, but his expression now was completely different from the one he had when dinner began. Earlier he had been evaluating. Now he was reflecting. You know, he said. When you spend most of your life in the Corps, certain instincts never really disappear. Daniel smirked. Like giving long speeches at dinner? Thomas ignored him. I mean the instinct to recognize leadership when you see it. The room quieted again. Linda sat down slowly, clearly interested in where the conversation was going. Thomas rested his hands on the table. When I retired, he continued, I thought I had seen the last generation of Marines who truly understood what command meant. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That sounds pessimistic. Thomas shrugged. Retired officers get that way sometimes. Linda gave him a look. You've never been good at hiding it. Thomas gave a small smile. Fair point. Then he looked back at me. But tonight reminded me of something. I waited. That leadership doesn't stop evolving. Daniel nodded slightly. That sounds like what you two were talking about earlier. Thomas glanced toward him. It is. Then he turned his attention back to me. When you walked into this house tonight, I assumed Daniel had brought someone home who was outside that world. He gestured lightly around the room again. The Marine Corps has shaped this family for decades. Linda nodded quietly. It really has. Thomas continued. So I thought I needed to protect that tradition. Daniel frowned slightly. Protect it from what? Thomas looked at him. From someone who might not understand it. Daniel looked back at me. Well, that assumption didn't exactly hold up. Thomas gave a small nod. No, it didn't. The honesty in that admission seemed to shift the atmosphere in the room once more. Because men like Thomas Reynolds don't usually admit when they've been wrong. Not easily. But tonight he was doing exactly that. I'll say something else too, he continued. Daniel leaned forward slightly. What? Thomas looked at me again. If Daniel plans to spend the rest of his life with you, he paused, then he's going to have to understand something very important. Daniel looked suspicious. I'm not sure I like where this is going. Thomas ignored him. He's going to have to understand that being married to someone with your kind of responsibility isn't ordinary. Daniel crossed his arms. I figured that out a while ago. Thomas shook his head slightly. No, son. You've only seen part of it. Daniel looked curious now. What do you mean? Thomas leaned forward a little. I mean, command doesn't end when someone leaves the base. That sentence landed quietly but clearly. People think leadership is something that only happens in uniform, he continued. But the reality is... He looked back at me briefly before finishing the sentence. Command follows you everywhere. Daniel thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. Yeah, he said. I've noticed that. Linda laughed softly. That explains why you two sound like you're running a strategy meeting half the time. Daniel grinned. Maybe we are. Thomas leaned back again. Then he looked directly at his son. You're lucky, you know. Daniel frowned. Why? Thomas gestured toward me. Because the woman sitting across from you tonight didn't just earn her rank. He paused. She earned the responsibility that comes with it. Daniel didn't joke this time. He simply nodded. I know. Thomas watched him for a moment. Then he said something that clearly surprised him. Good. Linda smiled warmly at both of them. And the room felt calm again. Not the polite calm from earlier in the evening. A genuine one. Because something important had changed. The man who started the night believing he needed to judge the woman his son brought home was ending it acknowledging that she belonged in a world he respected deeply. But before the night ended, there was one final moment that made everything clear. A moment that had nothing to do with rank, and everything to do with family. The house had grown quiet by the time the conversation finally slowed down. Coffee cups were empty. The pie plates had been cleared. Outside the windows, the Florida night had settled into that calm stillness that usually comes long after dinner ends. Daniel and Linda had moved into the kitchen again, rinsing dishes and laughing quietly about something I couldn't quite hear, which left Thomas and me sitting across from each other at the table. For a few moments neither of us spoke, not because there was tension, but because sometimes the most important conversations are the ones that don't need to continue. Thomas finally leaned back in his chair again, folding his arms loosely. You know, he said, this dinner didn't turn out the way I expected. I gave a small smile. Not for me either. He nodded once. I thought tonight was going to be simple. How so? I figured Daniel would bring someone home, he said. We'd talk, I'd get a sense of who she was, and the evening would end with me deciding whether she understood the kind of life our family has lived. I listened. That's what fathers do, he added. I understand. He studied me for a moment before continuing. But what actually happened was something else entirely. I waited. The woman who walked into this house tonight didn't need to prove she understood that life. He paused. She's already leading it. The room stayed quiet after that. In the kitchen, Daniel laughed at something Linda had said, the sound drifting faintly down the hallway. Thomas heard it too. Then he looked back at me. You know what surprised me the most tonight? What? That you didn't correct me earlier. I knew what he meant. You could have stopped me the first time I started talking about Barrett, he said. That's true. But you didn't. No, why? The answer was simple. Because you cared about what you were saying. He raised an eyebrow. That's the reason? Yes. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You spent years serving at that base, I said. Your experience mattered. He thought about that for a moment. And you let me talk for half an hour because you respected that. Yes. He nodded slowly. That's a rare kind of patience. Daniel and Linda returned to the dining room then, carrying the last clean plates. Everything okay in here? Daniel asked. Thomas looked at his son. Just finishing a conversation. Linda sat down again. Well, it looks like the evening turned out better than it started. Daniel laughed. That's an understatement. Thomas looked at both of them for a moment. Then he turned back to me. There's one last thing I want to say before the night ends. Daniel raised his eyebrows. Should I be nervous? Thomas ignored him. He looked directly at me. When Daniel told me he wanted us to meet you tonight. He paused briefly. I thought I needed to decide whether you belonged in this family. Daniel opened his mouth to say something, but Thomas lifted a hand slightly. Let me finish. The room went quiet again. Thomas continued. I was wrong about one thing. I waited. It wasn't my place to decide whether you belong here. He glanced toward Daniel, then back at me. That decision was already made the moment my son chose you. Daniel looked stunned. Linda smiled softly. Thomas leaned forward slightly. And after tonight? He gave a small nod. I can say something else with complete confidence. Daniel leaned closer. What? Thomas looked at him. You chose someone who understands responsibility. Then he looked back at me. And someone who understands respect. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Not awkward. Just full. Daniel finally broke the silence. Well, he said slowly, that might be the closest thing to a speech Dad has ever given about approval. Linda laughed. That's exactly what it was. Thomas shook his head slightly. Don't make it dramatic. Daniel grinned. Too late. I stood up then, picking up my jacket from the back of the chair. It's getting late, I said. Daniel stood up as well. We should probably head out. Linda walked us to the front door, still smiling warmly. You're welcome here anytime, she said. Thank you. Thomas followed us into the hallway. For a moment none of us moved. Then he extended his hand. Not a formal Marine salute this time. Just a handshake. But it carried the same meaning. Drive safe, he said. I will. Daniel opened the door, and the cool night air drifted into the house. As we stepped outside and walked toward the car, Daniel looked over at me. You realize something, right? What? My dad started this evening thinking he needed to teach you something. I smiled faintly. And how did it end? Daniel laughed. It ended with him realizing he had just met someone he respected. I glanced back toward the house once more. The porch light glowed softly behind us. Respect, I said quietly, usually starts with listening. Daniel nodded. Tonight proved that. And as we drove away from the house, I realized something else too. The man who had belittled me at dinner had learned something important before the night ended. Not about rank. Not about command. But about something even more powerful. The kind of respect that only exists when two people finally see each other clearly.